The wind blew heavy over the plains that afternoon, carrying with it the bitter taste of dust and the weight of things left unsaid. Ava and Olivia, twin girls no older than 7, sat among the smoldering remains of what had once been their home. The cabin was nothing more than a pile of blackened timber now, its charred walls whispering of a fire that had taken everything from them. Ava's small hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her fingers raw from where she had tried to save what little she could before the flames took it all. Olivia, her twin, clung to her sister as though afraid to let go, her tear-streaked face hidden against Ava's shoulder. The smoke still hung heavy in the air, swirling like ghosts around them, but the girls didn't move. They didn't have anywhere to go. The silence of the moment was thick, broken only by the distant crackle of firewood still burning somewhere in the wreckage. Ava's eyes scanned the horizon, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. There was nothing left. No parents, no home, just the two of them, stranded in a world that seemed to offer no hope. Then, in the distance, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. The girls barely noticed at first, too wrapped up in their own grief. But as the sound grew louder, Ava lifted her head, eyes squinting against the setting sun. From between the burned trees and scattered ruins, a lone figure appeared. A cowboy, riding slowly on horseback. His hat was low over his eyes, and his silhouette loomed large against the fading light of the afternoon. He didn't say a word as he approached, but there was something in the way he rode, steady, confident, like he belonged in this wasteland of broken dreams. The girls barely reacted at first. It was as if they didn't expect anyone to come. The cowboy's presence was like a ripple in the stillness, but he wasn't like the others who had passed through the town before, people who only came and went without a second thought. No, this man was different. He didn't look like he had much to offer. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed from years of use, and his face carried the marks of a hard life. But there was something in his eyes that held their attention, something that made Ava's heart race in a way she couldn't explain. He stopped a few paces away from the girls, his horse shifting on the dry earth beneath him. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stared down at them, the weight of his gaze pulling at their hearts in ways they didn't understand. Ava swallowed hard, looking up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" she asked, the question more out of instinct than anything else. She didn't expect an answer, but his response was simple and direct. "I'm here to take you with me," he said, his voice low and steady, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Ava's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't process what he was saying. Take them with him? To where? To do what? But Olivia's grip on her tightened, and for the first time since the fire, Ava felt something stir within her. Hope, maybe? Or was it just the instinct to survive? The cowboy didn't wait for an answer. He nudged his horse forward, the animal stepping lightly over the ground, as if it had known its role in this moment long before it had arrived. He pulled the reins gently, then stopped in front of the girls. "You're not safe here," he said, his eyes scanning the wreckage around them. "There's nothing left for you." Ava glanced at Olivia, who looked up at her sister with wide eyes, fear and confusion painted on her face. The twins had always relied on each other, even when their world had been whole. Now, with nothing left but ashes and dust, Ava felt a heavy weight settle over her. She was all Olivia had left. "What do you want with us?" Ava asked, her voice barely more than a breath, but the words hung in the air like a question that needed an answer. The cowboy hesitated, then looked down at them, as if deciding how much to say. "I don't want anything from you," he said softly. "I'm just offering you a chance to get out of this place, a chance to survive." Ava felt her chest tighten. She didn't trust him, couldn't trust anyone anymore. But what choice did they have? The world they knew had burned away, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. Could she leave? Could she trust this stranger to lead them to something better? Olivia's hand tugged at hers, a silent plea for her to act, to do something, anything, that might change their fate. Ava turned back to the cowboy, her decision made in the pit of her stomach. "Where will you take us?" she asked, the words barely leaving her lips. He nodded slowly, almost as if he had expected the question. "Wherever you want to go, but we'll start by getting you out of this hellhole." His voice softened, almost too gently for a man who seemed so hardened by life. "Come on, we don't have time to waste." Ava looked at Olivia again, who nodded silently, her small hand slipping into her sister's. Ava reached for the horse's reins, her fingers trembling as she took hold of them. She didn't know where they were going, but wherever it was, it had to be better than here, better than the ruin of what had been their home. She climbed up behind the cowboy, Olivia beside her, and as the horse's hooves carried them away, the last of the cabin's ashes fluttered behind them like a memory fading in the wind. As the cowboy led them further away from the wreckage of their past, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something even more uncertain than what they had left behind. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the dry land, but there was no warmth in the evening air. It was as if the world itself had cooled, leaving them to navigate a future filled with nothing but questions. Ava kept her hands wrapped tightly around the reins of the horse, her knuckles white against the worn leather. Olivia sat beside her, her head resting on her sister's shoulder, exhausted but too scared to sleep. Ava knew they were both thinking the same thing. Who was this man, and what did he want with them? Why would a stranger, a cowboy no less, stop to help two girls like them? The cowboy didn't say much. He was the type to keep his thoughts to himself, letting the journey unfold in silence. Ava had grown used to silence in the last few days. Ever since the fire, the world had felt quieter, emptier. But something about this silence was different. There was a sense of purpose to it, as if the cowboy had already decided what was going to happen next, and he didn't need to waste words. It was the kind of silence that made Ava feel like she was waiting for something she couldn't yet understand. They rode for hours without speaking, the horse's hooves soft against the earth, the sound of the wind brushing through the sparse trees around them. Ava felt her body tense with every mile they put between themselves and the burned-down cabin. She wanted to believe that this was the beginning of something better, but the doubt gnawed at her. She had learned the hard way that people didn't always keep their promises. And the cowboy? He was a man of few words, a man who came and went without a second thought. Could she trust him? Could she really leave everything she knew behind? When the first signs of night began to fall, the cowboy finally spoke. His voice was low and rough, like the sound of wind through dry grass. "We'll make camp soon. You need to rest." Ava nodded, though she didn't feel tired. It was hard to think about resting when her mind was so full of questions. She glanced at Olivia, who was now awake and looking around nervously, taking in every new sight as though she expected something to jump out from behind the rocks or trees. "Where are we going?" Ava asked, her voice hesitant, but strong enough to carry across the silence between them. It was a question she had wanted to ask from the moment the cowboy had offered his help, but she hadn't known how to say it. Now, it slipped out without warning. The cowboy didn't look at her as he answered. His gaze was fixed on the road ahead, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Somewhere safer," he said simply. "You can't stay where you were. That place is nothing but ashes now." "Is that it?" Ava pressed. "Is that all you can say?" There was a pause, a long stretch of silence that made Ava feel even more uncertain. The cowboy finally glanced at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice still calm, but now tinged with something Ava couldn't place. "I'm offering you safety, not promises. I don't make promises to anyone." Ava opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. He was right, in a way. He wasn't promising them a perfect life, or even a safe one, but he was offering them something she had never known in her short life. Freedom. Freedom from the fire, from the chaos, from the silence that had followed them like a shadow. But what would that freedom cost? She wasn't sure she wanted to find out. "I don't trust you." Ava said finally, the words slipping out before she could stop them. It wasn't a harsh statement, but it was true. She didn't trust him, and she wasn't sure she ever would. She had learned the hard way that trust was a fragile thing, something easily broken. She had seen people make promises only to watch them fall apart when things got hard. She had seen the way people turned their backs when you needed them the most. The cowboy didn't flinch at her words. He just nodded as if he had expected it. I didn't ask you to trust me, but if you want a chance, this is it. You'll need to make a choice soon, Ava. I'm not going to force you. You can walk away anytime. The offer was simple, and it was almost too easy. All they had to do was trust him, but trust felt like something that would take a lifetime to rebuild. Could she trust him? Could she really leave everything she knew behind for a chance at something better? Where are we going? Olivia asked, her voice small, as though she didn't want to interrupt but needed to know. She looked up at Ava, her eyes wide and searching for reassurance. Ava could see the same doubt in her sister's face that she felt in her heart. They both wanted to believe that this cowboy was their way out, but the world had never been that kind to them before. We'll find a place to rest tonight, the cowboy answered, his tone flat, offering no more than that. Ava didn't respond. She simply nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. The reality of the situation was starting to set in. They were alone now, and it wasn't just because they had no home. It was because they had no choice but to follow a stranger into the unknown. The night air was cool as the cowboy guided the horse to a small clearing by a stream. He tied the horse to a nearby tree and began setting up a small camp. Ava watched him move, wondering how much of this he had done before. How many nights had he spent on the road, alone with nothing but his thoughts? Ava didn't know, but there was something about him that felt both familiar and foreign. She didn't know if he was their savior or just another danger waiting to happen. I'll take the first watch, Caleb said, as if reading her mind. Ava nodded, though she wasn't sure if he'd meant to say that to her. She didn't argue. She was too tired to argue, too confused to make any decisions. She just sat beside Olivia, wrapping her arms around her sister as the stars began to fill the sky above them. The world felt heavy with questions, and Ava couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still yet to come. The next few days passed slowly as Caleb led Ava and Olivia across the plains, away from the ruins of their old life and into an unknown future. Each step away from the burned-down cabin felt like a step toward something better, though Ava wasn't sure what that something was. The world stretched out before them, wide, desolate, and full of possibilities, but also dangers. They rode through barren stretches of land, across dusty hills and cracked earth, with no signs of life except for the occasional rustle of wind or the distant cry of a bird of prey overhead. For the most part, Caleb said little. He had no need for conversation, it seemed, and Ava couldn't blame him. What could he say that would make them feel any better? He wasn't their friend. He wasn't even their ally. He was a stranger. He was simply a man who had chosen to take them in for reasons unknown. And that made Ava uneasy. The first time she felt the weight of Caleb's protection came when they crossed a small creek. The water was shallow, barely more than a trickle, but the rocks beneath it were slippery, and the current was strong enough to make the horse lose its footing. Olivia's foot slipped in the water, and she nearly lost her balance. But Caleb was quick to reach out and steady her. "Careful," he warned, his voice low but firm, as his hand wrapped around Olivia's arm to guide her safely back to the dry ground. Ava's heart skipped a beat as she watched the simple gesture, something small yet meaningful. She didn't know why, but she felt a flicker of relief in her chest. Caleb wasn't just an indifferent stranger. He was a protector, a reluctant protector, perhaps, but a protector nonetheless. As they continued their journey, Caleb took on the role of teacher in a way that felt natural, even though he never explicitly said it. He showed them how to find water by looking for the right signs in the land. The way the earth around a tree or bush would be darker, indicating moisture beneath the surface. He taught them how to make a simple fire by rubbing sticks together and using dry grass as kindling. And most importantly, he taught them how to listen to the land. When they sat around the campfire at night, Caleb would point to the stars, explaining the constellations, showing them the direction of north, east, south, and west, teaching them how to navigate the world when there was no map. Ava listened intently, and for the first time since the fire, she felt something akin to safety. Maybe it wasn't complete safety. The world was still wild and uncertain, but for the moment, they were together. Caleb was showing them how to survive, not just physically, but emotionally too, by creating small moments of comfort and routine in a life that had previously been full of chaos. One night, while Caleb was cleaning the horse's saddle, Ava and Olivia sat by the fire, their eyes watching the flames flicker. Olivia was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are we following him?" Olivia asked, her eyes wide with the confusion that Ava had been feeling ever since Caleb had shown up. "He's a stranger. He could be taking us somewhere worse." Ava glanced over at Caleb, who had his back turned to them as he worked. She wasn't sure if he had heard Olivia's question, but he didn't react. "I don't know," Ava replied honestly, "but I think he's trying to help us." "But why us?" Olivia pressed. "We're just two girls. He doesn't owe us anything." Ava didn't have an answer for that. She had asked herself the same question countless times. Why was Caleb helping them? What was he getting out of it? Maybe he just wanted to ease his own conscience. Maybe he was looking for redemption. But Ava didn't have enough answers to satisfy her curiosity. All she knew was that they had no other choice but to follow him. I think he's just trying to do something good," Ava said after a pause, her voice soft but steady. "And maybe we can do something good too, by sticking together." Olivia didn't respond immediately, but Ava saw the shift in her sister's expression. She wasn't fully convinced, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Ava wasn't sure if she believed in Caleb completely either, but she was starting to believe in their journey, if only because they had no other choice. As the days wore on, Ava and Olivia began to rely more and more on Caleb's guidance. They started to feel the weight of his protection, not just as a physical barrier from the dangers of the world, but as a steady presence, a constant in the chaos of their lives. Caleb never pushed them to open up about their past. He never asked them about their parents or their home or how they had ended up alone in the world. He just allowed them to be, which in a way was the most generous thing anyone could do. But Caleb's own past was still a mystery. Ava often found herself wondering about him. What had brought him here, to this desolate stretch of land, to these two girls who had nothing left to lose? The thought lingered in her mind, but it was a question she didn't feel ready to ask. One evening, as they camped by a small stream, Caleb told them to rest while he went to gather firewood. Ava and Olivia sat near the edge of the water, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For a brief moment, the world seemed peaceful. The tension between them had lessened, and they were starting to feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves, something that wasn't defined by loss or fear. "I still don't understand him," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the water. Ava nodded, her eyes fixed on Caleb's silhouette as he disappeared into the trees. "I don't either," she admitted, "but I'm starting to think he's not here to hurt us." "I hope you're right," Olivia said softly, her voice carrying a quiet hope. As the fire crackled between them, Ava couldn't help but wonder if the cowboy's arrival had been fate, or if it was simply chance that had brought him to their side. Either way, she knew one thing for sure. They had a long way to go, and Caleb's role as their protector had only just begun. As the days turned into weeks, the journey became less about survival and more about the unspoken bond that began to grow between the three of them. Ava and Olivia, still unsure of the cowboy's true intentions, found themselves slowly warming to him. They began to trust him, not because they had any real reason to, but because he was the only one who had been there for them when everything else had fallen apart. Caleb was a man of few words, but there was something steady and unyielding about him that made Ava feel safe. Each morning, he would wake up before the sun, starting a fire and preparing breakfast, his movements methodical and sure. Ava found herself watching him in silence, taking note of the way he worked, the quiet confidence with which he handled everything. Even when things went wrong, when the weather turned harsh or the path grew rough, he never seemed rattled. He was a man who had lived through storms, both literal and figurative, and came out the other side stronger for it. One evening, after a long day's travel, they set up camp near a small river. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling brightly above them, but the air had grown cold. Caleb busied himself with gathering firewood, while Ava and Olivia settled near the campfire, huddled together for warmth. "Caleb," Ava began, her voice breaking the silence. He didn't look up, but he paused for a moment, waiting for her to continue. "Where are we really going?" The question had been on her mind for days, but she hadn't found the courage to ask it until now. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He placed another log on the fire and stared into the flames for a moment. The crackling of the fire was the only sound for a long time. Ava waited, her heart racing in her chest, hoping for some kind of answer, some clarity. "We're going west," he finally said, his voice low and calm. "I got a place there, a small ranch. It's not much, but it's safe." Ava absorbed his words, but they didn't give her the answer she was looking for. Safe? What did that really mean? They had been running from something, she knew that, but she had no idea what it was. Caleb's past was a mystery, something he never talked about, and though she had tried to ask, he always deflected. She felt a growing sense of unease as she realized that, despite the protection he offered, Caleb was hiding something. "Why won't you tell us more?" Olivia asked, her voice soft but full of curiosity. Caleb glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. "Some things are better left unsaid," he replied. "The past has a way of catching up with you." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Ava realized that Caleb wasn't just their protector. He was also someone who was running from something, someone who had a past full of ghosts. He wasn't just a cowboy trying to do good. He was a man with a story, and Ava was beginning to suspect that the story he wasn't telling them was the one that mattered most. That night, as the campfire flickered and the wind howled softly through the trees, Ava lay awake, staring at the stars above. Olivia had fallen asleep beside her, her soft breathing a reminder that, no matter what lay ahead, she still had her sister. But Ava couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Caleb than he was letting on. His silence wasn't just a result of his stoic nature. It was something deeper, something he was hiding from them. She tossed and turned, her thoughts racing, until she finally heard a soft rustling in the distance. Caleb's voice, low and quiet, drifted to her from across the camp. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, and at first, Ava thought she might have imagined it. But as she listened closer, she realized that Caleb was talking to himself, his words barely above a whisper. "I never should have gone back. It was my fault," he muttered, the words falling heavy in the still night air. Ava's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? What had happened in his past? She lay still, holding her breath, as Caleb's words became inaudible again. The fire crackled softly, and she heard him move, the sound of his boots pressing into the dirt. It was clear that he didn't want anyone to hear him, but Ava had heard him, and the weight of his confession settled over her like a heavy blanket. The next morning, Caleb was back to his usual self, quiet, reserved, focused on the task at hand. But Ava couldn't forget the words she had overheard. It was clear now that Caleb wasn't just a stranger trying to help them. He was a man with demons of his own, and those demons weren't done with him yet. For the next few days, Ava watched him more closely. He was still the same protective figure, guiding them through the wilderness and showing them how to survive. But there was something different in his eyes now, something darker. He was constantly on edge, his gaze darting around like he was expecting trouble to come from any direction. Ava didn't know what had happened to him, but she could sense that whatever it was connected to the way he had offered them his help in the first place. He wasn't just trying to save them, he was trying to save himself, too. As they rode on, Ava found herself thinking more and more about the man they were following. Caleb had never spoken of his past, but the words he had muttered in the night had opened a door in her mind that she couldn't close. What was he running from? And why had he chosen to take two orphan girls with him on this journey? She glanced over at Olivia, who was riding silently beside her eyes wide with uncertainty. Ava didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. They weren't just running from their past. They were all running from something, and sooner or later, the past would catch up with them. The days grew longer as they traveled further west, and Ava couldn't shake the feeling that they were headed towards something both inevitable and dangerous. Caleb's demeanor had shifted in subtle ways. More alert, his movements more deliberate, his eyes always scanning the horizon, as if he expected trouble to find them at any moment. The cowboy who had once seemed so sure of his role as their protector now felt like a man on the run, always looking over his shoulder, haunted by the past he refused to speak about. They had been riding through the dry, dusty plains for days, the landscape vast and unforgiving. The wind picked up in the afternoons, swirling dust in their faces and making the journey seem even more grueling. Caleb kept his distance from the girls when they were on the road, never too far, but never too close either. It was as if he wanted to be there for them, but didn't want to let them get too close, didn't want them to see the parts of him that were still broken. One evening, after a long day of riding, they set up camp near a cluster of trees that offered little shade, but some protection from wind. Caleb made the fire, his hands steady as always, and they ate in silence. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of coyotes in the night. It was as they sat around the fire, their bellies full and their minds restless, that they heard the sound of hooves approaching in the distance. At first, Ava thought it might be just another traveler or a group of settlers passing by. But as the sound grew louder, Caleb stiffened, his hand immediately reaching for the rifle slung across his back. "Stay here," Caleb ordered, his voice low and controlled. Ava watched him as he moved silently into the shadows, his figure blending with the night. He didn't look back at them as he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Ava and Olivia alone by the fire, the weight of their uncertainty pressing down on them. The hooves grew closer, and the sound of voices began to filter through the quiet night air. Ava could hear them now, two men, laughing, their voices rough and taunting. Ava's heart began to race as she felt a chill creep down her spine. She knew these men weren't just passing through. They were here for something or someone. She glanced over at Olivia, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. "They're coming for us," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. Ava swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't know how she knew, but she could feel it in her bones. These men weren't just random strangers. They were a threat, and Caleb knew it. That's why he disappeared into the night. He had been expecting them. As the voices grew louder, the two men finally emerged from the shadows, their horses pulling to a stop just outside the firelight. One of them was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long duster coat that billowed in the wind. The other man was shorter, with a thin mustache and a grin that made Ava's stomach churn. The taller man glanced over at the girls, his eyes cold and calculating. Well, he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "Looks like we found ourselves a couple of lost souls." Ava didn't speak. She just watched them, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea who these men were, but she could feel the danger in the air. Olivia's grip tightened on her arm, and Ava could feel her sister's fear radiating through her. "Where's the cowboy?" the shorter man asked, his grin widening. "I'm sure he's around here somewhere." Ava's pulse quickened. "Caleb." Before she could say anything, the cowboy himself emerged from the shadows, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. He didn't move toward them immediately, just stood still, watching the men carefully, sizing them up. There was a tense silence in the air as the two sides studied each other. "You should turn around," Caleb said calmly, his voice steady. "This is my land, and you've got no business here." The taller man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that cut through the night air. "Your land, huh? Funny. We didn't see any of your fences or property lines when we came through. Looks like we're just passing by, but maybe we'll stick around for a while." His eyes flicked toward the girls, and the meaning behind his gaze made Ava's skin crawl. After all, it's not every day we get to see two lost little girls all alone in the wilderness. Ava felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear in her chest. These men weren't just here for Caleb. They were here for them. Caleb didn't flinch. He took a step forward, the rifle in his hands now resting easily, his fingers close to the trigger, but not yet aimed. "I told you once. Turn around and leave." Now, the shorter man took a step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his belt. His eyes were dark, full of malice. "Or what?" he sneered. "You're going to shoot us? In front of your little girls?" Caleb's expression didn't change. He wasn't here for a fight, but he wasn't going to let them intimidate him either. He had no intention of letting them get any closer to Ava and Olivia, not after what had happened to them before. "Just leave," Caleb said, his voice low and commanding. "I'm not asking again." The men hesitated, the tension in the air palpable. Ava could see it in their eyes. They were trying to decide whether to press forward or to back off. For a moment, there was only silence, the wind rustling through the trees, the crackling fire the only sound. Finally, the taller man muttered a curse under his breath and turned toward his companion. "This ain't over," he said, his voice filled with venom. "We'll be back." And with that, they turned their horses around and rode off into the night, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of dust and a lingering sense of danger. Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked over at Caleb, who was already walking back toward them, his face still set in the same unreadable expression. "They won't be back," Caleb said softly, though Ava could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. He didn't believe that, not completely. He knew they would be back, and next time, they wouldn't leave without a fight. The days after the encounter with the two men were eerily quiet. Caleb, despite his calm exterior, carried a weight on his shoulders that wasn't easily shaken. Ava and Olivia could see it in the way he moved, always alert, always ready for the next threat. The firelight had long since flickered out, but the quiet tension between them remained, stretching out like the stillness before a storm. For the next few nights, Ava lay awake more often than she would have liked, listening to the sounds of the wilderness around them. The wind howling through the trees, the distant calls of coyotes, the soft rustle of grass, as something moved just beyond the firelight. But what kept her awake wasn't the noise, it was the uncertainty. Caleb's past had caught up with him once, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it would do so again. The men who had ridden into their camp weren't the last threat they would face. They were only the beginning. By the time the sun was dipping below the horizon one evening, the sense of impending danger was thick in the air. Caleb had been preparing the camp as usual, but this time his movements were sharper, more deliberate. His eyes constantly scanned the surrounding land as though he was expecting someone, something. Ava didn't ask him what it was, but she knew he was preparing for the worst. She just didn't know what that worst was. The silence was broken when the sound of hooves once again reached their ears. This time, however, there was no mistaking it. The familiar heavy thud of multiple riders was unmistakable. Ava's stomach dropped. She glanced at Caleb, but he didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he reached for the rifle that he had kept close by. His face was hard, his eyes narrowed as he adjusted his grip on the weapon. "They're back," Caleb muttered under his breath, his voice low and strained. Ava felt her heart pound in her chest. She hadn't known fear like this before, not even after the fire, not after everything that had happened. But now, as the sound of approaching horses grew louder, her entire body tensed, ready for whatever was coming. Olivia was huddled close to her, her small hand grasping Ava's arm in a silent plea for comfort. Ava squeezed her sister's hand, but even she couldn't promise that everything would be okay. It was clear now, this wasn't just about survival. This was about confronting the past that Caleb had tried to outrun, and the past had finally caught up with them. The riders came into view, their horses kicking up dust as they slowed to a stop in front of the camp. Caleb stood tall, rifle in hand, ready for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Ava's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the tall man from before, the one who had threatened them. But this time, there was no hesitation in his eyes. There was no mockery, no grinning taunts. His expression was cold, hard, filled with something far darker than anything Ava had seen before. "Thought you could hide forever, Caleb," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "We've come for what's ours." Caleb's eyes hardened, but his stance didn't waver. "You've got nothing of mine, and you're not taking anything else." The air between them crackled with tension, the weight of unspoken history hanging heavy. Ava could feel in her chest a deep, choking pressure, the kind of feeling you get when you know a fight is inevitable but can't quite prepare for it. The man chuckled darkly. "You don't get to make the rules anymore, Caleb. Not after what you've done." He motioned behind him, and a second rider emerged from the shadows, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes narrowed in threat. Ava's heart raced, and she took a step back, instinctively moving toward Olivia. This wasn't a standoff anymore, it was a fight. And it was one that Caleb couldn't win alone. She knew that, but for the first time since they had met Caleb, she wasn't sure if they would survive this. "Let them go," Caleb said, his voice steady. "This is between you and me. The girls have nothing to do with it." "Too bad," the tall man replied, stepping forward. "They're the reason you've got to answer for what you've done. We're here for them, too." Before Caleb could react, the second rider spurred his horse forward, drawing his gun. In that split second, everything seemed to happen at once. Caleb moved swiftly, knocking the rifle out of the second man's grasp before the shot could be fired. A blur of motion, a shout of rage, and the sound of hooves pounding in the earth. The first man lunged forward, his hand reaching for the gun at his waist, but Caleb was faster, his rifle aimed at the man's chest. The entire scene unfolded with a speed and brutality that Ava could hardly comprehend. Caleb's calmness, his composure in the face of violence, was something she couldn't fully grasp. But in that moment, as he stood between the men and the girls, Ava understood the depth of his resolve. He wasn't just protecting them. He was making a stand against the ghosts of his past, against everything that had come to claim him. "I said leave," Caleb growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Or I'll make you." The standoff lasted only a few moments, but it felt like an eternity. Ava held her breath, watching, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, the tall man, realizing that they were no match for Caleb's fury, slowly backed down, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You think this is over?" He spat, his voice thick with venom. "You think you can hide behind these girls forever?" Caleb's gaze never wavered. "You're done here." With one last glance at the girls, the men turned and fled, riding off into the night, leaving nothing but the fading sound of hooves in the distance. The silence that followed felt heavy. Ava and Olivia stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Caleb didn't lower his rifle until the men were out of sight, and even then, his body remained tense, his fingers still clenched around the weapon, as if he expected them to return at any moment. When he finally turned to the girls, his expression softened just slightly. "You're safe," he said, his voice hoarse, though it carried more weight than any promise he had made. Ava didn't know if he meant it or not. She didn't know if any of them were truly safe. But in that moment, as the cool night air settled around them and the stars began to fill the sky, she knew one thing for sure. Caleb had kept his word. He had faced the past head on, protecting them with everything he had. The battle wasn't over. It never would be, but for tonight, they were safe. And that was enough.